The first time I noticed something was off was late one night in September. Let me back up a little first. My name's Dan. I'm 43 and I've been trucking for more than 2 decades. Life on the road is a double-edged sword. It's freeing and lonely all at once. After my divorce earlier this year, I found myself leaning into the loneliness. There's a strange comfort in the hum of the engine and the endless highway. A peace in the quiet that kept me from thinking too much about what went wrong between me and Sarah. That peace, though, was shattered one night on Route 22. I'd driven that stretch of road for years. It's remote, running through parts of the state that hardly anyone visits unless they have a reason. The kind of place where you could drive for miles and not see another soul. It was late September, the end of summer fading into fall, and I was 4 hours into my drive when something happened that I can't quite shake, even now. It was around midnight when I passed through Pine Hollow, a small town that barely registered as a blip on the map. The road was empty, and the only sound was the rumble of my engine and the occasional hiss of static from the CB radio. Then I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror, closer than I liked. They were tailing me, and it made me uneasy. I figured it was just another driver, maybe someone in a rush, so I pulled over to let them pass. Slowing down, I eased onto the gravel shoulder. The headlights behind me slowed too, mirroring my every move. I stopped, and when I looked in the mirror again, the headlights had vanished. Just like that, there was nothing but darkness behind me, the road empty for miles. I told myself I was tired, that maybe they'd turned off somewhere, but that didn't sit right. Something felt off. After that, I needed a break. I pulled into a rest stop a few miles up. It was a lonely place, just a couple of vending machines, a bathroom that had seen better days, and a few parking spots. I parked my rig, killed the engine, and leaned back in my seat, trying to relax. That's when I noticed my headlights were flickering. I got out, thinking maybe a connection was loose. As I checked, I found an old flashlight lying under the driver's seat. It wasn't mine. It was heavy, the kind of flashlight people used decades ago, covered in scratches and dents. My own flashlight was a newer LED one, and I kept it in the glove box. I set the old one down on the seat, a chill running through me. I had no idea how it ended up there. I decided to take a minute, headed to the restroom to splash some water on my face. It was quiet, the air crisp, and the hum of the vending machines echoed across the empty lot. When I got back, I saw them. Footprints in the dirt leading to my driver's side door. They weren't mine. I could tell by the size and the sole pattern. My heart hammered in my chest, and I looked around, but the place was deserted. Just me and the dark stretch of road. I got back into the cab and locked the doors. My hands were shaky as I started the engine, wanting to get away from that place. As I pulled out, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing there. There was no one. An hour later, the radio started acting up. The static was louder than before, and beneath it, I could hear something else. A voice, faint but unmistakable. It was saying my name, drawn out like a sigh. Dan. I turned the volume down, but the voice seemed to get louder, mixed with the static, repeating my name. My hands shook on the wheel, and I turned the dial, desperate for anything to drown it out, but the voice wouldn't stop. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure, just behind my seat, barely visible in the dim light of the cab. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing there. My pulse pounded in my ears, my mouth dry as I faced forward again. I knew something was wrong. I kept driving, my eyes flicking to the mirrors, every shadow seeming darker than before. I just wanted to get to the next truck stop, to be around people, to feel less alone. I pulled in eventually, the lot mostly empty except for a sleepy attendant and a couple of other rigs. I parked, turned off the engine, and tried to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. An old photograph tucked under the dashboard. My heart sank as I pulled it out. It was a picture of me and Sarah taken years ago. We were smiling, her arms wrapped around me, both of us standing in front of my truck. I hadn't seen that photo in years, and I was sure I'd thrown it out after the divorce. I just sat there, staring at it, dread creeping in. I remembered a night years ago on this very stretch of Route 22. Sarah and I had been arguing, my voice raised as I gripped the wheel, not paying attention. I'd run someone off the road that night. I never stopped, never looked back. I told myself it was nothing, that they were fine. But now, with the photograph in my hand, the flashlight, the voice on the radio, I knew it was all connected. Whoever I had left behind that night wasn't done with me. And as I sat there in the shadows of the truck stop, I knew I'd never be alone on Route 22 again. Story 2. My name's Dan, and I'm a long-haul trucker. I've been doing this for over 20 years, and I guess you could say I know the highways better than I know my own life sometimes. I'm 43, recently divorced, and more comfortable with the steering wheel in my hands than I ever was trying to make a marriage work. There's something about the road that makes you feel both free and small at the same time. After Sarah left, I threw myself back into my work. Just me, my truck, and the open stretches of asphalt. It felt like the right place to figure things out, to be alone and deal with my regrets, 1 mile at a time. One of those stretches I drove more often than I should have was Route 22. It's a desolate piece of highway, twisting through empty land where the silence seems heavier. It was late September, somewhere between summer and fall. I remember that night vividly. The kind of night when the air was just beginning to turn, crisp enough to need a jacket, and the stars hung low, watching. I was 4 hours into the drive, moving steady past Pine Hollow, a small town barely holding on to existence, when something happened that still keeps me up some nights. It started with a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. The road was empty until then, nothing but the hum of my tires and the occasional crackle of the CB. But suddenly, there they were, too close behind me. I figured it was someone in a rush, and I wasn't in the mood to deal with the tailgater, so I pulled over, letting them pass. I eased onto the gravel shoulder, slowed to a stop, but the headlights did the same. It felt like whoever was behind me was copying my every move. I stared into the mirror, my eyes straining against the darkness. And then, just like that, the lights were gone. There was nothing. No car, no sound, just the empty stretch of Route 22 behind me. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself they must have turned off somewhere, though that didn't make much sense. But I pushed the uneasy feeling away, got back on the road, and kept driving. A few miles later, I decided to stop at a rest area I knew well. It wasn't much, just a few vending machines, an old bathroom, and enough room for a couple of trucks. I pulled in, killed the engine, and let out a breath, my fingers tapping on the wheel. My headlights had been flickering when I parked, almost as if they were tired too. I got out to check it out, thinking maybe a bulb was loose or something. That's when I saw it. Lying underneath my seat was an old flashlight, one of those heavy metal ones, scratched and scuffed like it had been through a lot. The thing was, it wasn't mine. My flashlight was an LED, small enough to keep in the glove box, and I'd never seen this one before. A shiver went through me as I set it down on the seat. I didn't know where it came from, and that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I walked to the restroom, hoping some cold water would shake off the weird feeling creeping up my spine. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that rings in your ears, and the air was colder than I remembered. When I got back to my truck, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Footprints. Fresh ones, leading up to the driver's side door, small and not mine. I looked around, my pulse thundering in my ears, but there was no one else there, just the empty lot and the silent road beyond. I climbed back into the cab, locking the door behind me, my hands trembling a bit as I did. I started the engine, wanting nothing more than to leave that rest stop behind. The headlights flickered again before they stayed steady, and I pulled out, checking the mirrors every few seconds, expecting to see someone standing there. There wasn't anyone, but the feeling didn't go away. About an hour later, the radio started acting strange. Static crackled louder than usual, and beneath it, I could hear something. Faint, but there. A voice. My name. Dan. It came through, soft, almost drowned out by the static, but unmistakable. I turned the volume down, but the voice kept calling my name, growing louder, more insistent. My hands were clammy on the wheel, my breath catching in my throat as I twisted the dial, trying to change the station, to find anything else. But the voice wouldn't leave. I glanced up into the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A shape just behind my seat, barely lit by the glow of the dashboard. My stomach dropped, and I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing. There was no one there. I turned back to the road, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, knowing that something was terribly wrong. I kept driving, the road stretching out ahead, empty and endless. I pulled into a truck stop eventually, needing to be around other people, needing to know I wasn't losing my mind. There were only a couple of rigs parked, a sleepy attendant inside the convenience store, the neon lights flickering above the door. I parked, turned off the engine, and leaned back in my seat, my eyes closing for a second, trying to calm myself. Then I saw it. An old photograph, tucked under the edge of the dashboard. I pulled it out, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at it. It was a picture of me and Sarah, taken years ago, before everything fell apart. We were smiling, her arms wrapped around me, standing in front of my truck. I thought I'd thrown that picture out after the divorce, tossed it along with everything else that reminded me of what we'd lost. I sat there, dread clawing at my insides. And then I remembered. One night, years ago, on this very stretch of road, Sarah and I had been fighting, her voice echoing through the cab as I gripped the wheel, not paying attention. I'd run someone off the road that night, saw their headlights disappear into the ditch. I told myself it wasn't my fault, that they were fine. I never stopped, never looked back. But now, with that flashlight, the footprints, the voice on the radio, and this photograph, I knew it was all connected. Whoever I had left behind that night wasn't finished with me. And as I sat there, the shadows stretching long across the lot, I knew I'd never really be alone on Route 22 again. Story 3. My name's Sam. I'm 56, a long-haul trucker, and a father of 2 grown kids who've long since moved out. I've spent more nights on the road than I could count, and I always thought I was a no-nonsense guy, a practical one. But there's one night on mile marker 37 I can't quite shake, even now. I was out on Red Ridge Pass in late November. It's one of those stretches of road that truckers like me know all too well. Long, empty, and unforgiving, especially during the colder months. The kind of place where one mistake can put you over a cliff. I'd heard the stories from other truckers about strange things out there, but I always brushed them off. I mean, you hear a lot of ghost stories on the road. Most are just guys trying to pass the time or scare the newbies. But that night, I found myself face to face with something that made me rethink all those stories. It was around 2 in the morning, the time when fatigue starts to seep in and the hum of the engine becomes almost hypnotic. I remember glancing at the dashboard clock, the green digits glowing. 2:14 a.m. The road was quiet, the sky pitch black, and the air cold enough to bite through my jacket. Then, as I approached mile marker 37, I heard it. A faint cry for help. At first I thought it was the wind, maybe a trick of my tired mind. But it grew louder, more distinct. A woman's voice, desperate, pleading. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. I turned off the engine, and the world went silent. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, a good, sturdy LED I've had for years, and stepped out into the cold. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding strange in the emptiness. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping across the rocky roadside. There was nothing. just the wind rustling through the scrubby trees. I was about to turn back when I caught a glimpse of something, movement just off the road. I aimed the flashlight and saw her, a woman standing there, drenched, her hair plastered to her face. She looked like she'd been caught in a storm, though the sky was clear that night. She was shivering, her eyes wide, staring at me like she was lost. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I called, taking a step closer. But before I could get another word out, the flashlight flickered. I shook it, cursing under my breath, and it blinked out completely. I was plunged into darkness, my heart pounding. I fumbled with the switch, and when the light came back on, she was gone. I stood there, my breath misting in the cold air, straining to hear anything, footsteps, rustling. But there was nothing. I hurried back to the truck, locking the door behind me. The cab felt suddenly too small, the darkness pressing in through the windows. I started the engine, wanting to put as much distance between me and mile marker 37 as possible. That's when I noticed the newspaper. It was on the passenger seat, yellowed and brittle, like it had been sitting there for years. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The headline read, "Woman and child killed in tragic accident on Red Ridge Pass." Beneath it was a photo of a woman, the same woman I had just seen. My stomach twisted as I read the date. November 23rd, 1986, exactly 35 years to the day. I felt a chill run through me, colder than the night outside. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, some sick joke, but deep down I knew better. I'd been alone out there. There was no one around to play tricks. That night, I parked at a truck stop about 30 miles down the road. It was one of those places that never really closes, with tired-looking waitresses and coffee that tastes like it's been brewing for days. I sat in the diner, nursing a cup of that awful coffee, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The newspaper was still on the seat in my truck, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. It was around 4 in the morning when I finally went back to the cab, hoping to get a couple of hours of sleep before hitting the road again. I climbed in, shivering as I turned the heater on. That's when I heard it. A humming, soft, almost like a lullaby. It was coming from the back of the cab. I turned, my heart in my throat. There was no one there, but the sound continued, a gentle melody that I hadn't heard in years. It was my mother's song, a tune she used to hum to me when I was a kid, scared of the dark. My eyes burned, and I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Fear, real and raw, the kind that claws at you from the inside. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something. I drove into the nearest town and found the local library, digging through their archives. It took hours, but I found it. An article about a young mother and her child who died on that stretch of road. She'd swerved to avoid a truck, they said, gone over the edge. The photograph in the paper was grainy, but I recognized her. And then I saw the detail that made my blood run cold. Her name was Margaret, the same name as my mother, and the child's name, it was Samuel. I sat there staring at the words, my hands numb. My mother had died when I was a teenager, and I'd never known the exact spot. My dad never talked about it, but now it felt like she'd found me, out there on mile marker 37, trying to tell me something, to say goodbye in a way she never got to. I still drive Red Ridge Pass from time to time, and every year, on November 23rd, I make sure to leave a flower by mile marker 37. Maybe it's for her, maybe it's for me, but I know one thing for certain. Some goodbyes come late, but they're still goodbyes all the same.